Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balkavage, and today we're talking about blood sugar, we're talking about glucose, we're talking about insulin, we're talking about testing. Now, I read a post this weekend, and somebody was talking about balancing your blood sugar. I listened to a podcast, somebody said, hey, you gotta, one of the big things that a person who's got thyroid issues has to do is balance their blood sugar. But I don't know that people really understand what's going on here. And so what does that mean? I've got to balance my blood sugar. Many times when I'm talking to people and they've been told they're insulin resistant and they got high glucose or high insulin and they're storing body fat, people say, you got to reduce your glucose, you got to reduce your carb intake. But when you really listen to people, they're not eating much in the way of carbohydrates, but they still have higher blood sugar values. So fasting blood sugar is too high. It's in the 90s, in the hundreds. Their hemoglobin A1C is above 5.6, 5.7. They're pre-diabetic based on what the current standards are. And their doctors are saying, hey, the reason you're overweight is because you're insulin resistant, you gotta reduce your glucose, you gotta eat a better diet. And if they just listen to their client, they find out that the person's already on a low carb diet. They're already not eating a lot of glucose. So how can we get glucose regulation to work properly? And then two, what does it mean to balance your blood sugar? And what do you do with that information when somebody's telling you to do it, especially if you're already doing what you think you should be doing, which is eating a lower carbohydrate, low processed food diet? Well, I'm gonna use today's Thyroid Thursday and probably a couple more Thyroid Thursday days videos to kind of explain maybe what's going on here and give you some insight. So, I don't know what most people mean by balance your blood sugar, but I think the general consensus here is we want to get blood sugar with it to be managed better. And typically, because we in this country, we have a tendency to eat too much carbohydrates, too much processed food. One of the best things you can do to help improve blood glucose regulation is to eat low processed food, more whole food. Keep it that simple. Whether it's low carb, keto, vegetarian, vegan, just eat more whole food, less processed food. That's probably the best place to start. But one of the things we need to understand is, where's this glucose coming from, right? Where's the glucose, the sugar that we're measuring in the bloodstream? Where does it come from? Is it only coming from our nutrition? Is it only coming from what we eat? No. Matter of fact, you have 4 primary hormones that are constantly able to raise glucose. So our body needs glucose. It's a primary fuel for the tissues. Our body has the ability to bring in glucose from the food we eat, to break down proteins and fats into glucose. And we've got 4 primary hormones, cortisol, glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone, they have the ability to put more glucose into the bloodstream. So glucose is critical. If you have higher fasting glucose when you're getting your blood draw done, it is probably not just the result of what you're eating, but it's being driven by a couple factors. And one of those factors could be that you've got some type of excessive cell stress going on. Cells don't want glucose to come in. I talk about the cell stress or cell danger response. And that is one of the biggest factors I see that's driving up glucose in circulation, is that the cells don't want it, but we still have signals from our brain to make it because we need it, but the cells are resisting it, okay? In some spaces, they would call that insulin resistance. I really call it glucose resistance because I think the issue really stems from cell danger response, not being able to use the glucose and make it into energy. I think that's the bigger issue, and that's a whole nother video. So what's optimal for a fasting glucose? 82 to 88 is the range I like to use. I know your lab report will say maybe 60 to 100, but I think those ranges are a bit too wide. How can you test it? You can do a finger stick at home, and you can easily and relatively inexpensively check your blood sugar values on a regular basis. You could wear a CGM. It's a device you wear on the back of your tricep, and it'll continuously tell you what your glucose is in a fasted state, in a fed state, an hour after meal, 2 hours after meal, or immediately after meal. It's really neat to wear, but be careful. Some people overanalyze these things and get so caught up in what their blood sugar values are that they're missing everything else in their life to manage their blood sugar. And then obviously the most standard way people find out about what their blood sugar values are is just getting a blood draw done. Now, the problem is, I think when you get a blood draw done, what you want to consider is the best thing to do when you're getting a blood sugar done is get it done in the morning in a fasted state, not dehydrated. So 12-hour fast is what I recommend for my patients. Drink a glass or two of water before you go get a blood draw done so you're not dehydrated. Don't take your medications in the morning before a blood draw if you don't have to. And that's how we want to test it. But we don't want to just check your glucose value. Okay, we want to check a couple other tests. Now, I rarely ever run 1 or 2 tests all by themselves. I'm usually looking at a little bit broader panel because all the tests are influenced by other factors in our physiology. But if you're going to go get some glucose levels tested and you want to see what's going on, you want to get a fasting glucose, you want to get a hemoglobin A1C, and that's like a 3-month marker of how much glucose is staying in the bloodstream on a regular basis. And what often isn't done is insulin or C-peptide. Now, both of these things are a marker of how much insulin the pancreas is making. C-peptide, probably a better marker, but it's often a more expensive marker. A lot of physicians don't know what to do with the number. So I think insulin is the more common number that we take a look at, but you could definitely run both. So what we want to do is when we're looking at the blood sugar, we want to see where's the blood sugar. Is it in a fasted state between 82 and 88? If it's not, then we need to if it is or it isn't, we need to look at a couple other things. We want to see what our hemoglobin A1C is. So hemoglobin A1C we want that number to be between 5.1 and 5.3%. When you look on your lab report, it'll say the high range is 5.6 or 5.7, depending on the lab. And when it gets over 5.6, 5.7, then you're insulin resistant. Well, we want to use this range 5.0, 5.3 as a more optimal range because we want to see when that's creeping above that range, we're already into glucose resistance. We're already starting to resist the impact of insulin. So we want to look at a tighter range because in functional medicine, we're looking at optimizing or improving function before disease sets in or fixing the dysfunction so we get rid of disease. And then insulin, we want to see this number between 3 and 8 optimally. Why? Insulin is released when we eat to get glucose out of the bloodstream and into the tissues because when we eat, there's a high amount of glucose entering the bloodstream, so we're going to need some more help getting it out of the cells. Now, glucose gets transported into cells via glucose transporters. All those glucose transporters rely on T3 to some degree to function appropriately or to be generated. Okay, so anytime you have higher fasting glucose, we have to assume that maybe there's a problem with thyroid physiology. Okay, so what we want to see is that in a fasted state where you're not eating, your body should just be regulating hormone, the amount of glucose in the bloodstream by the 4 primary hormones that generate glucose on a regular basis. And the number one hormone that does that, especially in a homeostatic state, is glucagon. It's the hormone that comes from the pancreas. It tells the liver, hey, we need a little bit more glucose. We need a little bit more glucose. And the liver can break down stores or generate glucose endogenously and release that glucose into the bloodstream. So the brain, the tissues, the muscles all have glucose on an ongoing regular basis. So we want to see what those values are. Now, why should we run insulin? Because if you have a fasting glucose of, let's say it's 86, it's right in the range. What I want to know, what a functional medicine practitioner should want to know is how much insulin is it taking to maintain that glucose. If you have a glucose of 86 and an insulin of 5, that's pretty good, right? It doesn't take much glucose in a fasted state to keep the insulin, or it doesn't take much insulin in the fasted state to get glucose out of the cells. And it should be low because you're not generating massive amounts of glucose in a fasted state. You're generating massive amounts of glucose in a fed state. So we want that number low, but if let's say your fasting glucose is 86, it looks good, right? But your insulin level is 22, that means it's taking a lot of insulin in a fasted state to keep forcing glucose that the body is making into the cells and tissues. And the cell and tissue that's probably going to get stored in most is not the ones we want it to, the muscle, the brain, the other tissues that need to use it. It's probably going to be going into your fat cells to get stored. So these are the 3 tests that you need to run. In a fasted state, if you see that your insulin levels are above 8, even if your glucose is high or normal, consider the fact that you've got some type of excessive cell stress going on. And what the body is doing is it's producing glucose at a high level in that fasted state, and it needs more insulin to help get it into cells and tissues.